The CEO had 48 hours to find a wife. His choice was unthinkable. What happens when desperation takes over?
Welcome to Whispered Truth, where touching stories come alive. Let's jump into today's story.
The stainless steel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Mark Davis's minimalist kitchen, a stark contrast to the chaotic mess that churned in his gut. He was a man meticulously crafted, from the perfectly tailored suits that hung in his walk-in closet to the precisely timed schedule that governed his days. Yet today, the clock was a taunting reminder of his impending doom. The Sterling Enterprises dinner, a make-or-break event for Davis and Associates, was less than 48 hours away, and his perfectly constructed world was about to crumble. He stared at the reflection of his own anxiety in the polished chrome of the toaster. The face that stared back was pinched, drawn. He'd always prided himself on his control, his ability to navigate any situation with calm precision. He was, after all, the CEO, the man who made things happen. But this required a level of performance he simply couldn't muster on his own. He needed a wife, and he needed one now. Not a real one, of course, but a convincing imitation. The thought was absurd, a ridiculous farce he'd concocted in a moment of panic, and it was now his only hope. A wave of self-disgust washed over him. This wasn't who he was, or who he wanted to be. But the stakes were too high. He couldn't afford to fail. He needed to put on the show, no matter how uncomfortable it was. He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the speed dial as he wrestled with the monumental rawness of his idea. He had to call Elena. She was the only option. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elena, the woman who arrived twice a week with her cheerful disposition and her worn-out vacuum cleaner, was now going to be his lifeline. She was a ghost in his life, someone he acknowledged with a polite nod but rarely truly saw. He knew her name, her schedule, the brand of cleaning products she used, yet he knew nothing of the woman beneath. He only ever saw the cleaning lady. The realization pricked at him. Maybe that was part of the problem. He lived in a bubble, a world of polished surfaces and curated interactions, and he'd completely ignored the lives, the complexities, that existed just beyond his perfectly structured existence. He dialed her number, the phone ringing twice before she answered, her voice, a gentle melody in the stark silence of his opulent apartment. "Hello, Mr. Davis?" She sounded cautious, as if she already suspected something was amiss. He hesitated, the absurdity of his request suddenly feeling more pronounced, more audacious. "Elena," he began, his voice tight, "I need to ask you something a bit unconventional." She didn't interrupt. She only offered a soft hum of acknowledgement, and he pushed on, trying to sound confident even though he felt anything but. "It's about this dinner, the one with Sterling Enterprises. It's crucial for the company." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I need you to pretend to be my wife for one night." He held his breath, waiting for her reaction, picturing the bewilderment, perhaps even the amusement, that would spread across her face. He could practically hear her internal monologue. Did the CEO just ask me to pretend to be his wife? There was silence, a drawn-out silence that stretched his nerves thin. He was about to start explaining, to justify his ridiculous request, when she spoke, her voice surprisingly calm. "Pretend to be your wife, like for a play, like they do in Hollywood." He nearly laughed. Elena, ever the pragmatist, was already dissecting the situation, turning his desperate plea into some sort of theatrical performance. "Yes, Elena, like a play, I know it's an awful thing to ask." He wanted to apologize, to explain that he wasn't a man who was used to needing anything, let alone something as ridiculous as this. He pushed the thoughts aside, his focus zeroed in on the immediate need. "I will pay you, of course, handsomely. It will be a one-time thing, a simple performance, and after that, it's like nothing happened." He rattled off numbers and justifications, trying to convince her, and perhaps also himself, that this was a rational, calculated business decision, and not a desperate act of self-preservation. He knew it was wrong, a morally dubious maneuver. He knew he was exploiting a person's financial hardship for his own gain. But he was so deep in the hole he dug for himself that it was hard to see any other way out. Elena was his only chance, and he was, in that moment, incapable of considering any alternatives, any long-term impacts. "So, Elena, what do you say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He could hear a sigh on the other end of the phone, long and drawn out, as if she was carrying the weight of his entire world on her shoulders. She didn't say yes, not exactly, but she didn't say no either. There was a long, drawn-out pause where he could hear the muffled sounds of her life, the clatter of dishes, maybe, or her grandmother's television playing softly in the background. He knew about her grandmother's illness, about the mounting medical bills she was struggling to pay. He knew because he sometimes saw her on the phone in the hallways, her voice hushed, her face etched with worry, before it quickly morphed into the usual pleasant, non-existent smile she offered him. He was using her desperation, and he knew it, the thought a bitter pill he was unable to swallow, but one he wasn't about to spit out. He needed her, and that was all that mattered in this moment. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice regaining some of its usual warmth. "I need the money. My grandmother, she needs a very expensive medication, and things are just difficult." She paused again, and he could hear the resignation in her voice, the quiet acceptance of her situation, of his proposition. "I guess I can pretend to be your wife. For one night. As you say, like a performance." The word performance echoed in the silence, and for a moment, Mark allowed himself a breath of relief. He hadn't entirely ruined everything. Not yet, at least. "Thank you, Elena. Thank you so much," he said, trying to infuse his voice with gratitude. But he knew it sounded hollow, almost like a business transaction. He was using her, and both of them knew it, and it was something he'd have to live with. He quickly outlined the plan, the dress code, the details of the investors, the entire fabricated persona he had created for them. It felt surreal to be discussing such a ludicrous charade in such a detached and businesslike manner, as if this was a perfectly normal Monday morning conversation and not a desperate attempt to salvage his career. Elena listened patiently, her questions specific and practical, and he couldn't help but notice her remarkable composure. She asked about their history, how they met, what she was passionate about. She was turning his fabricated world into a real entity. For an instant, he wondered if he could ever possibly make amends for dragging her into this mess. He had not only requested her to be someone she wasn't, but had also reduced her to a mere pawn in his game of corporate chess. He pushed the thought away again, focusing solely on the immediate task at hand. As they wrapped up the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line that had redefined him and his relationship with Elena, in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. He hung up the phone, the silence in the apartment pressing in on him, heavy and suffocating. He glanced around his perfect apartment, and everything felt different somehow. The meticulously ordered objects, once symbols of his control, now seemed like silent witnesses to his deception. He was trapped in his own perfect whirl, a gilded cage he had built himself, and there was no escaping it. The dress was a midnight blue sheath, a simple, elegant garment that hung on Elena with a grace that surprised Mark. He'd bought it that morning, a hurried, almost panicked purchase from a high-end boutique, a transaction that felt as cold and detached as everything else in his life these days. He'd selected it based on an image he had of the ideal wife, a woman who was both sophisticated and approachable, but he hadn't considered how it might look on Elena. Now, as she stood before him, the dress seemed less like a costume and more like a natural extension of her, a subtle enhancement of her quiet dignity. He'd brought it to the apartment, along with a crash course on what he expected of his fake spouse. His living room was no longer a symbol of his success. It was now a stage for their bizarre rehearsal. He even printed out flashcards with basic information about himself, his company, and the investors, as if Elena was a contestant in a bizarre game show. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on him. He watched her as she moved, trying to assess her movements and how she carried herself in the dress. She was different than she was in her uniform. He could only see her as the help and not an individual with her own life, her own dreams and aspirations. The realization was jarring. "So remember," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous living room, "the key is to be engaged, but not too engaged. Smile, nod, ask questions, but don't dominate the conversation. They want to see a supportive wife, not a corporate strategist." He cringed at his own words, at the blatant condescension they contained. He was talking to her like she was a prop in his life, not a person with agency and intelligence. He saw a slight flicker in her eyes, a hint of something that might be annoyance, or perhaps it was just the way the light hit her, but the expression was fleeting. She didn't challenge him. She just nodded, her face a mask of polite attentiveness. "And when they ask about how we met, remember the story I gave you." He held up a card, a carefully curated narrative of a chance encounter at a charity gala, a story so bland and uninspired that even he found it difficult to believe. He had poured so much energy into building his career that the rest of his life, his personal life, had been left utterly barren. He had no stories to tell because he had not allowed himself to live them. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something for himself that was for pure enjoyment. She took the card and skimmed it, her eyes scanning the text, her brow furrowed slightly as if she were reading a particularly dense legal document. "A charity gala?" she asked, her voice tinged with something that sounded like a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Like the ones you see on TV?" She smiled, the smallest of smiles, and he thought for an instant how lovely it was. It was a real smile, not one that was plastered for the cameras, and it made him wonder, briefly, about her life. He shook away the thought. He couldn't afford to get distracted. He had a performance to perfect. "Yes, like the ones on TV," he said, trying to maintain a tone of authority, even though he felt like he was slipping into a surreal play he had neither written nor directed. He felt a sense of discomfort at her questioning of his constructed narrative. Her questioning highlighted the artificiality of his life, how much of it was constructed for the benefit of others. "Now," he continued, clapping his hands together, "let's practice. I'll be Mr. Sterling, and you be my adoring wife." He struck a pose. A stiff, exaggerated smile plastered across his face. He felt ridiculous. Elena didn't laugh. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. She took a deep breath and said, "Okay, Mr. Davis, let's do it." She transformed herself, shifting from the quiet cleaning lady to an actor playing a role, but she wasn't just mimicking him. She had added subtle details, a head tilt here, a gentle touch on his arm there. He was surprised. She was good, shockingly good. They went through the motions, the stilted conversation, the practiced smiles, and with each run-through, Elena added more layers to her character. He started to see glimpses of a side of her he had never imagined. Wit, intelligence, a quiet confidence that radiated from within. Her questions became less about the surface details and more about the substance of the conversation. She asked about the intricacies of the business, about the market trends, about his long-term strategy. He was taken aback. She wasn't just asking because she needed to know the answer. She seemed genuinely interested, almost curious, and her insights were surprisingly sharp. He found himself talking to her as if she was a peer rather than a hired actor. He hated that his own prejudice had blinded him to her capabilities. She was clearly much more than she appeared to be.
Wait! Sorry to interrupt you, but please subscribe to our channel Whispered Truth and reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your subscribe and like helps us a lot. And comment your favorite part. Now let's get back to the story.
He stopped the rehearsal, a strange mixture of fascination and discomfort swirling inside him. "Where did you learn about all this?" He gestured vaguely with his hand, indicating the business talk. He felt like he was finally looking at her for the first time. He was looking at someone who had opinions, intelligence, and insights, and not merely an invisible person who cleaned his floors. She smiled, a genuine smile this time, the kind that reached her eyes and made them sparkle with amusement. "My father," she said simply, her voice soft. "He owned a small business before he passed. I helped him. I'm good with numbers." He was silent, processing her words. He was hearing her life, and the gaps that she wasn't filling were forming pictures in his mind. He imagined a small business, a family working together, a community perhaps, a world so different from his own that it felt like he was peering into an alternate universe. He was used to clean floors, and now he had a business partner, a colleague who was much more qualified than he had expected. He thought he was buying a performance, but she was offering something else entirely. Something real. He felt a stab of shame, but also a spark of something akin to respect. He had misjudged her, completely and utterly, and it was a realization that shook him to his core. This was no longer just a charade. It was becoming something else, something more complex. The rehearsal ended abruptly when her phone buzzed. It was a text. Her expression changed slightly as she read it. "How's my grandmother?" she said quietly, her voice suddenly laced with a concern he recognized. The smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of worry. "She's not feeling well." He watched her as she gathered her things, the dress now appearing less like a costume, more like a burden, and a sudden urge to help her, to fix the situation, washed over him. He wanted to offer her help with her grandmother's treatment and medicine. He knew his offer would not come from a place of kindness, but instead because of the way he had misjudged her. He pushed it aside. He had a dinner to think about. He had a company to save. "Okay," he said, trying to sound as if he didn't care at all, as if this whole endeavor was nothing to him and her distress was not even a tiny bit concerning. "Tomorrow night, then?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, and he saw a flicker of something in them, something that felt strangely familiar, like a shared secret or a bond created in the midst of their charade. He didn't understand it. He was sure he was an emotionless person, or so he thought. As she left, the silence in the apartment felt different again. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of anticipation, a sense that something had irrevocably shifted. He sank onto the couch, the discarded flashcards scattered around him like fallen leaves, and looked around at the apartment that, only hours before, was a symbol of his success and status, now looked like a testament to his failure. He picked up one of the cards, the bland, fabricated story of how they met, and crumpled it in his fist, the words suddenly feeling inadequate, almost insulting. He had underestimated Elena, and in doing so, he had underestimated himself. He was no longer simply trying to put on a performance. He was facing something far more complicated, a reality that threatened to expose the carefully constructed facade of his life. He had hired an actress, but he had inadvertently found something else, something he didn't quite understand but knew he couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that was brewing inside him. The dinner was tomorrow. He had a job to do, a company to save, but for the first time he knew that it wasn't the only thing at stake. The restaurant was a symphony of muted elegance, a carefully curated space designed to impress. Soft lighting cast a warm glow on the crisp white tablecloths, and the murmur of hushed conversations created a backdrop of sophisticated ambience. Mark, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, felt a familiar knot of tension tighten in his stomach. He'd meticulously planned every detail of this dinner, from the seating arrangements to the wine selection, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. This wasn't just another business meeting. It was a performance, a high-stakes gamble with the future of Davis and Associates hanging in the balance. He glanced at his watch. Elena was late. He checked his messages. Nothing. He called her. It went straight to voicemail. A wave of panic washed over him. Had she changed her mind? Had something happened? He tried to rationalize his feelings. He didn't care about her as a person. It was a business deal. He was buying her help and nothing more. But the panic that was rising was making him feel as if she was more to him than just that. He told himself to stop thinking like that. This was for his company. He needed her to show up. He was already sitting at the table when they arrived, Mr. Sterling and his two associates, and he could see the way they looked at him, the slight edge of disappointment in their eyes. This was a critical aspect of the performance, and he couldn't afford to falter in his act. He was supposed to be the successful man, the family man, the man who had it all. But he was only just the first one. The waiter had offered them drinks, and he had ordered a bottle of their best wine, his mind racing, his panic barely contained under his practiced smile. He was about to start the introductions, trying to buy more time, when he saw her. Elena stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the soft lighting, and for a moment, he was speechless. She had changed everything. She was wearing the midnight blue dress, and with it, she had transformed herself. He had seen her in that dress before, during their awkward rehearsal, but this was different. She moved with a grace and confidence that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet power that radiated from within. Her hair was pulled back in a simple but elegant style, and she wore minimal makeup, just enough to enhance her features without detracting from her natural beauty. She was, in a word, stunning. He watched as she approached the table, her eyes meeting his with a slight smile, and the knot in his stomach seemed to loosen slightly. She was there. She hadn't abandoned him. The others were watching her, and he saw the shift in their expressions, the subtle widening of eyes, the appreciative nods. They weren't looking at a cleaning lady. They were looking at a woman of poise and elegance, and she was commanding their attention. He made the introductions, his voice calm and collected, as if this was a completely normal dinner with his wife. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing towards Elena, "this is my wife, Elena Davis." He watched her as she shook their hands, her handshake firm and confident, and he was aware of how much of his success was relying on her. She seemed to know what to say to each of them, how to charm them with small anecdotes and with her quiet demeanor. It was a flawless performance. The first part of the evening went smoothly, Elena gracefully navigating the social minefield of the dinner. She asked all the right questions, she smiled at the right moments, and her laughter was genuine and warm. He found himself watching her, his admiration and his confusion growing. She was not the woman he thought he had hired. She was someone different, someone with a presence that was both subtle and powerful. He was lost in his head. As the meal progressed, the conversation shifted from casual banter to business-related topics. Mr. Sterling, a man known for his shrewdness and his ruthless pursuit of success, began to grill Mark about his company's recent performance, about his strategy for the next quarter, and about the future of the company. Mark felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pressure building as the conversation intensified, and he opened his mouth to begin answering the questions in his usual manner, but Elena spoke up first. Her words were measured and insightful, and she was not playing the role of a supportive wife. She was an active participant, engaging in the conversation with intelligence and with her insightful point of view. She highlighted key areas of growth for the company, and she addressed potential challenges with a calm and level-headed approach. Mark was surprised, and he was starting to feel almost betrayed. She was supposed to be the fake wife, a prop, and she was transforming herself into a business partner. The others were also surprised by her insights, and he could see the way Mr. Sterling's eyes narrowed as he listened. He had expected a pretty face, a woman who would smile and nod, and she had turned out to be a sharp-minded strategist. It was clear to him that she was no longer part of his act. She was now stealing the show. He watched, his initial shock transforming into something else, something akin to pride. He was watching her in a new light, and it was almost like he was finally seeing her for the first time. She was captivating. She wasn't afraid to share her opinions or her ideas. She wasn't trying to be someone she wasn't, and in that act, she was being truly herself. He suddenly saw her as a human being who was intelligent, skilled, and someone who deserved to be at the table, not just because she was his pretend wife, but because she had the knowledge and wisdom to be there. He couldn't help but wonder what she would be doing if he had not called her. What would her life be like? He was sure that she deserved something much more than cleaning his floors. Mr. Sterling, his face impassive as ever, finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Mrs. Davis, I must say, I'm impressed. Your understanding of the market is remarkable. It is rare to find someone with such a clear strategic vision." Elena smiled again, her smile warm and genuine, and not the fake smile he had instructed her to give earlier. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a confidence that surprised him once more. "I believe in Mr. Davis's vision, and I'm happy to offer my perspective." Her use of we was telling. She had fully embraced the role, but she had also gone beyond it, taking ownership of the conversation and the situation. He was no longer the only one in charge. The conversation continued, with Elena leading it, and with her insightful comments and strategic questions, she had completely shifted the dynamics of the evening. Mark found himself listening intently, learning from her perspective, and he realized how much he had underestimated her. He was surprised by how much she had changed the evening. She was no longer his pretend wife. She was his equal. He had not hired an actress. He had hired a partner who was more than capable of leading the business with him. He found his feelings for her changing. It was no longer gratitude. It was something more akin to a begrudging respect. He was embarrassed by his initial assumptions. He was ashamed that he had only seen her as the help and nothing else. He had been wrong, so wrong, and he was now facing the fact that he was a fool. As the dinner drew to a close, he had a strange feeling, a sense that everything had changed. He had come into this dinner with the goal of securing the investment, and in the process, he had accidentally found someone who had the potential to change the course of his company and perhaps his life. He had hired an actress, and he had found a partner. He had hired someone to pretend to be his wife, and he had found someone who showed him how deeply flawed his life actually was. He had asked her to deceive them, and she had revealed something to him. Something important. The drive home was silent, the city lights blurring into streaks of color outside the car window. Mark, usually so precise and controlled, felt a strange sense of disorientation. The dinner had been a success, a resounding success, and yet he felt anything but triumphant. The carefully constructed facade he had built around himself was crumbling, and he wasn't sure if he was relieved or terrified. He glanced at Elena, her profile illuminated by the passing streetlights, her face a mask of quiet contemplation. She had been magnificent, her performance flawless, and he was now facing the uncomfortable reality of his own prejudices and misjudgments. He felt a need to say something, to acknowledge her, to somehow convey the shift that had occurred within him, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He had treated her like a pawn in his game, and she had shown him how completely wrong he was. He knew that he owed her an apology, and more, so much more. But he was finding it hard to find the words that expressed his deep remorse and his growing respect. He could no longer look at her as simply the help. She was so much more, and he had been completely blind to it. "Elena," he began, his voice a low murmur. "I don't know what to say. You were incredible tonight." He hated how inadequate his words sounded, how they failed to capture the depth of his gratitude and his awe. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and he saw a hint of amusement in their depths. It was a performance, Mr. Davis, she replied, her voice calm and even. We both played our roles. Her words were simple, matter of fact, and yet they carried a weight that made him flinch. She wasn't seeking praise. She wasn't looking for validation, and her ability to see through his superficial compliments made him feel even more ashamed of his previous behavior. She was more intelligent than he had assumed. He was certain now of that. He had misjudged her so much. Yes, well, it was more than just a performance. He wanted to explain everything that he was feeling, how he had underestimated her, how he had been blind to her potential, but he knew that his words would sound hollow and inadequate. He had used her, and nothing he said could take that away. He pulled into the driveway of his building, the silence in the car becoming more profound. He turned off the engine, and the hum of the city outside seemed to fade into a distant murmur. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and finally looked at her properly. He owed her a thank you. He owed her an apology. He owed her so much more than he could possibly give her. Elena, he said, his voice regaining some of its conviction, I was wrong about everything. I saw you as just my cleaning lady, someone who just showed up, and I didn't see the person beneath. You are brilliant, and I cannot tell you how deeply sorry I am for the way I behaved. You saved my company, and I owe you. She was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on her hands, and he could almost see the gears turning in her mind, the way she processed his words with a quiet intensity. Mr. Davis, she finally said, her voice soft, you don't owe me anything. We had a deal, and I upheld my part. Now we are even. Her words were precise, like a surgeon's scalpel, and they cut through the layers of his carefully constructed facade, exposing the core of his inadequacy. He wasn't even. He had taken advantage of her, and she had delivered. He was the one who was in debt, in the debt of her intelligence and her skills. He opened his mouth to say something more, but she stopped him with a raise of her hand. Mr. Davis, she said again, her voice laced with a quiet resolve, I want to ask you a question. After tonight, what did you think of me? Did you still see me as the help, or was it different? Her question was simple, direct, and it forced him to confront the depth of his own prejudices. He had to be honest. He had to tell her the truth. He looked at her. He saw her intelligence, her wit, her ability to take charge and lead a room full of investors. He saw her for who she was and not what she did. You were incredible. You were smarter and more capable than I could have imagined, and I am ashamed at how I behaved. You were not just the help to me. You were much, much more than that. He felt a burden lift off his shoulders. He was being honest for the first time, and he felt different. Better, somehow. She nodded, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. I see. It was a simple statement, but it held a weight that made him feel strangely vulnerable. He had finally seen her, and she knew it. They sat there in silence for a moment, the tension in the air thick and palpable, and he realized that this was the end of their agreement. The charade was over, the performance complete, and they were now two individuals facing each other across a chasm of unspoken truths. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the envelope with the agreed payment, his hand trembling slightly as he offered it to her. Here, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For your help, as we agreed. She didn't take the envelope. She simply looked at it, her expression unreadable. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice soft but firm, I don't want your money. He was shocked. He had come to rely on money, and he had assumed it was the solution to every problem. But she was defying his expectations, again. He had failed, once more, to understand what she wanted. He had been wrong about her from the start. What do you mean, he asked, his voice laced with confusion and disbelief. What do you want? She looked at him directly in the eyes. I want to work for you, not as your cleaning lady, but as your business partner. The words hung in the air, a challenge, an offer, and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. He was taken aback, his mind racing, trying to make sense of her request of this change. He had never considered such an outcome, and he was now facing the possibility of working alongside someone who had seen through his carefully constructed world and had called him out on it. He stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, and he felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. This wasn't just an offer, it was a proposition that had the potential to change everything. He could feel himself changing, and he wasn't sure what to expect anymore. He opened his mouth to answer, to accept, to reject when his phone rang. It was Mr. Sterling. He felt a jolt of energy. The decision had been made for him. He answered it quickly. "Mr. Davis, I trust you had a pleasant evening. Your wife is quite remarkable." The pause was telling. He knew that he would have to tell him the truth at some point, but he wasn't ready. "We were very happy you came. It was wonderful to see the business from a different point of view." He was playing along, and he knew he would have to confront Mr. Sterling later, but right now, he needed the win. "I believe we have a deal. We are willing to make the investment under certain conditions." Mark held his breath. This was it. He had won. But then, Mr. Sterling added one more condition, one that surprised him more than the first. "We also want Elena to be part of the leadership team as a strategic consultant." He looked at Elena, who was now smiling. She had somehow known. She had, once again, taken charge of the situation. "I think that can be arranged," he said, his eyes not leaving hers. She had done it again. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Davis and Associates was revitalized, injected with a new energy and a fresh perspective. The investment from Sterling Enterprises had gone through, and the company was not just surviving, it was thriving. But the most significant change was the shift in power dynamics within the company itself. Elena, no longer a ghost in the hallways, was now a force to be reckoned with. Her office, just down the hall from Mark's, became a hub of activity, her sharp intellect and her strategic thinking quickly gaining the respect of the entire team. She was not just a consultant, she was a leader, and her presence was transforming the entire culture of the company. Mark, meanwhile, was navigating this new reality with a mix of awe and trepidation. He had hired an actress to play his wife, and he had found a partner, a colleague, and a challenger. He was no longer in complete control, and it was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. He was facing the fact that his old ways had made him blind to her, and now he was forced to reevaluate his life, his choices, and his entire understanding of success. He had spent so much time building a career that his life outside of work had been neglected. He was now, finally, facing himself. The transition was not without its challenges. There were still whispers of doubt, subtle hints of prejudice from some of the older, more traditional members of the team. But Elena, with her quiet confidence and her unwavering resolve, quickly silenced them, not with anger or confrontation, but with the sheer force of her intellect and her clear vision for the future. She wasn't there to play games. She was there to work, and she made sure that everyone knew it. Mark watched her, a strange mixture of admiration and frustration swirling within him. He knew that he was partly responsible for the initial resistance. He had been the one who had dismissed her, who had seen her as nothing more than the help, and he was now trying to atone for his past mistakes. He spent hours in her office, discussing strategies, bouncing ideas off her, and he realized how much he had been missing, how much he had been blind to for so long. He had created a life of isolation for himself, and he was now realizing how much that had affected him. He was finally seeing people for who they were and not for how he expected them to be. He was slowly changing, and he knew that she was the reason for it. She was his challenge and his redemption. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside his office window, Elena knocked on his door. He had been waiting for her, although he would never admit that to her. The tension between them was something that had lingered since the dinner, a complicated mixture of respect, gratitude, and something else, something that he couldn't quite define, but he was starting to recognize the signs. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm, "we need to talk about Mr. Sterling." He knew this conversation was coming. The charade was over, and they had both agreed that Mr. Sterling had to be told the truth. "I know," he replied, his gaze meeting hers. "I was going to talk to him tomorrow." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I think he suspects something. He has not mentioned my role as your wife since that dinner, and I think he knows that it was a performance. And he knows he was part of it." He felt a tightening in his chest. He had been putting off this conversation, the moment when he would have to confess his deception, and he was not ready. He was worried about the fallout, about the consequences for the company, and he was ashamed of his actions. But now he had to do what he knew was right. The truth was the only option. "I agree," he said, his voice low. "I need to be honest with him. I owe him that, and I owe it to you." He paused, taking a deep breath, and looked at her. "Elena, I need to thank you, not just for saving the company, but for everything. You changed me, and I will be forever grateful to you." She met his gaze, her eyes holding a depth that he had never seen before. "Mr. Davis," she said softly, "you changed yourself. I simply gave you an opportunity to look at the world through a different perspective, and you saw it. That was you." He was silent, her words hitting him with a force that left him breathless. She was right. He had chosen to see her, to acknowledge her, and he had finally taken responsibility for his actions. It had been him all along. He had allowed himself to be blinded by his own arrogance, and he was now seeing the world in a new light, and she was part of that new world. He didn't know what he would be if he had not met her, if he had not made that phone call, that desperate plea. He was now a different person, and it was because of her. He would never be able to thank her enough. The next day, Mark and Elena sat across from Mr. Sterling in his opulent office, the tension in the room thick and palpable. Mark confessed his deception, laying bare his motives, his fears, and his misjudgments. Mr. Sterling listened patiently, his face impassive as ever. And when Mark was finished, he was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on Elena. "Mrs. Davis," he finally said, his voice low and measured, "I must say I admire your performance, but I also admired your intellect and your skills. You had me fooled." Elena met his gaze, her expression calm and composed. "It wasn't my intention to deceive you, Mr. Sterling. I agreed to the charade because I needed the money, but I made sure that I also offered my skills and my experience." Mr. Sterling nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Indeed you did, and that is why, despite Mr. Davis's initial indiscretion, I am still willing to invest in you both." He paused, taking a sip of his water, and then looked at Mark. "You chose to make a mistake, Mr. Davis, but you also had the courage to see your flaws and rectify them. That is what makes you worthy." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had expected anger, retribution, but instead, he had received understanding and even respect. He had expected to be punished for his misdeeds, and instead he was being given a chance. A chance to learn. A chance to grow. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice sincere. "I have learned a lot in the past few weeks, and I am committed to making this company the best it can be. Together." He glanced at Elena, his eyes meeting hers, and he saw a flicker of something that felt like a shared understanding, a silent agreement that transcended words. The meeting concluded with an understanding that had been forged not in deception, but in truth, not in hierarchy, but in partnership. Mark and Elena walked out of the building together, the city lights twinkling around them, and Mark realized that his life was no longer a carefully constructed performance. It was something much more authentic, much more meaningful, and it was only just starting. He walked her to her car, and they stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with an unspoken energy. He still couldn't name the feeling that she evoked in him, but he knew that he had changed, that she had changed him, and that he was finally on a path that was much more authentic and honest than the one he had been on. He had started by asking her to be someone she wasn't, and he had ended up finding himself. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "thank you for everything." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're welcome, Mr. Davis." She turned to leave, and he watched her go, a sense of quiet contentment washing over him. He had started with a deception, and he had ended up finding something real, something lasting, and that he knew was much more valuable than any investment. He had started looking for a fake wife, and he had found himself, along with a partner who would challenge him, push him, and make him a better man. He watched her car as it disappeared into the night. He smiled. He had won.
Hey, want to listen to another best story? Then click the floating video and subscribe for more.